The science of old is deterministic. The correct appears correct in retrospect. Something is proven because it is correct, disproven because it is incorrect. It leaves out the constructive side of science, hypothesis and conclusion. It leaves out the drive of the scientist, a will for new information to be surfaced. It leaves out an uncertainty, a decision or a process, in order to preserve the image of something which is measurable or quantifiable. An artwork doesn't appear on its own. It is the result of thought and action. It is a paradox, an absence of thought and inaction. The artifact is the product, the conclusion of a process. Why always my big brother? Someone held forward for his rationality, someone whose clear thinking has always bested me. The only games I could beat him at growing up were games of luck or physical skill. His ability to perceive the structure of something on its surface seems to always be regarded more heavily in modern society. I think ignoring the process reduces science to a standing reserve, which is a term Heidegger uses to describe a possible view of nature in which all resources and all organisms and things and ecosystems are viewed as things to be exploited. This view has no demands and cannot enter in dialogue with nature. And I think this stands in the same manner in science. Why always my big brother? It is no longer enough to be simply a realist or pragmatic, or a realist pragmatic. To allow the doubt of an ecological catastrophe is to walk towards a future unprepared. Once a catastrophe happens, it appears retroactively necessary. It was always bound to happen. We must accept it as necessary in the moment, yet paradoxically employ extreme measures to counteract it. The conviction that we have already lost is what we need to mobilize people to win. A cheap pseudo-optimism litters our world currently. The savior of religion, the savior of artificial intelligence, the savior of technological positivism. It will lead us to a dangerous state of complacency, inaction. The promise of a savior is also the promise of taking a back seat. When doing my research on the structure of things, specifically the creation of a model of the structure of something scientific, the creation of a scientific model, I can't help but think of two birds dancing. Is it a mating dance? Is it for territory? I can't help but think of the light at the end of a tunnel. Yet science tells me not to think. Science tells me to see and conclude, to measure, to quantify. Yet, this quantifiable thing that we are looking for has to be the predecessor to a conclusion. This is where I was most stuck during my research. I had done a visit to the Stam in Ghent, a natural history museum, and the structure of these relatively complex atomic models, which I assumed were models of a metal or something, due to their regular, repetitive, and quite compact structure, with no branches of any sort. It was quite cubic almost. These structures caught my eye, but I also wondered, how did we even get to these structures? What series of thoughts and events, what research, but also what steps within that research can lead to such a model being created. That was the basis for my research. It turns out much of my research ended up being quite unscientific. I think something that can exemplify what I'm talking about in quite a concrete manner, something I was so fixated on early on due to its straightforward scientific nature, would be Rutherford's gold foil experiment. A well-known experiment in which alpha particles are blasted through thin sheets of gold foil and receptors placed all around to see how the alpha particles would pass through or collide with the gold foil. And based on the data, Rutherford concludes that the previous atomic model, which was the plum pudding model of a circle with all the everything within the atom inside of that circle, was disproven. During the experiment, most atoms passed through the gold foil, a few of them colliding with something in the gold foil and bouncing off in a completely random direction with quite an extreme velocity. And based on this findings, he concluded that most of the atoms were hollow or had nothing in between, nothing of a physical nature, nothing that the alpha particles could collide with. But occasionally they did hit something and bounced off. And through these findings, he concluded the new atomic model, which presents a nucleus with protons and neutrons surrounded by electrons flying all around it in specific rings, or in his case, in the classic diagram with the sort of atomic shape. And I think whenever I was trying to do research on the step he took to go from the findings to the model, everything was left quite vague. His process was almost entirely negated or just not mentioned, as if it was something completely unimportant to the research. Was there a possibility for something intangible to exist between the particles? Was there any possibility that the electrons themselves collided with the particles and not the nucleus or something like that? Probably highly unscientific suggestions that I'm making now, but my point stands that the step in which the conclusion becomes in a scientific experiment is something that can be quite irrational or go against a very positivist view of the sciences. I think there is a parallel here between the sciences and art. An artwork also has a step of a becoming. If an artwork is an artifact, something tangible, even if it is an occurrence, not necessarily a physical object, it has to be brought into existence. An idea cannot be an artwork until it is physically expressed. And I think scientific research cannot exist if it is not drawn to some sort of a conclusion. Otherwise it is just using equipment with no further steps. I think the very structure of something can be drastically important in art. The structure of our process when we create art, the structure of the materials, structure of the artwork, its format, everything in that manner can be important. A zeolite, for example, through its structure, is something that filters the unwanted. I think an artwork or an artist is not a zeolite. An artwork is like a person. We can be reborn by changing ourselves. We always have an agency to change. As Arendt speaks about when he talks about natality, I think the art world has a strong fixation on death and endings and cycles, but not enough attention is brought to the natality, to the idea of birthing something, creating something. My original plan was to conclude the same way a scientific study would conclude, with a rational statement that envelops the subject which precedes it. But I think as I was reading and as these ideas regarding science sort of permeated my life during the process of making this short film, I have decided that it's not possible for me yet or ever to make such a conclusion about the creation of art, about the value, about why it is that science and art are separate from each other. I think all I can do is ask the question again. Why always my big brother?